You're listening to the Pharmacy Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Pharming Your Career podcast with host Dr. Erin L. Albert, where we explore a variety of healthcare and pharmacy-related topics, including career development, healthcare IT, informatics, innovation, entrepreneurship, STEM, women's issues, and more. Pharming Your Career podcast is part of the Pharmacy Podcast Network. Now, here's your host, Dr. Erin L. Albert.
Sarah Sladek, speaker, author, CEO. Thank you for joining us on Pharming Your Career.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here, Erin. Gosh, I've known you for so many years, and I'm just glad that we're doing this together. This is fun.
Yes. I'm so excited to have you on, and you're kicking off our season 2 of Pharming Your Career. So you're part of our fall season. I love that. So I always start with the same question that I ask all of my guests. How did you get to where you are today in your own career?
So I started out early in my career, right out of college, as a journalist. And then I moved into marketing. And the way I usually tell the story is that I was working for an association in marketing. And I kind of had journalism instincts go off. And I thought, there is a story here, because I had been attending a lot of national conferences. And I just had this moment where a light bulb went off. And I wondered to myself, why is it that everyone here is old enough to be my father? And why is it that on our board of directors, everyone is a certain age? And why is it that our most engaged members, and when I started looking at businesses, I started finding that most of the leaders were a certain age. All the influencers were a certain age or older. And I felt at that time, and this was the early 2000s, and I felt at that time, even then, wait a second, at some point, we are going to head into a real problem if we don't do a better job of passing the baton and thinking about the future and who is to come and what is to come. Because it really seemed to me that most organizations had their blinders on. And I felt strongly, because I had had an opportunity at a young age to move into leadership roles, and I felt strongly that we needed to do a better job at being advocates for younger generations, at listening to their points of view, at really planning and preparing for the future. And the other key piece that I was very familiar with and kind of heard rumblings on was this fact that we had this huge generation, the baby boomer generation, that had come into the workforce, and we just kind of stopped planning for who was coming next. And I knew that, as well as demographers knew, our nation's leaders knew, business owners knew, we knew that the generation that followed the baby boomers was much smaller, and that we eventually were going to run out of talent. And that's the situation we're in right now. We're seeing labor shortages. But anyway, early on in my career, I just kind of observed some of these trends, and I really wanted to do something about it. So I started a company, XYZ University. I have since authored 5 books and several research papers, and I'm continuing to investigate how to bridge some of these gaps that are occurring in the workforce, how to better plan for the future, and being that advocate for younger generations.
Yeah, I love that. And, you know, one of my interests, too, are kind of the changing demographics in college students, right? Because I had the opportunity to teach for a decade, and mainly millennials were part of that. And then they switched to kind of Gen Z, or X's children. So I found it really fascinating what the differences were between those two generations. But your most recent book, and you are a prolific writer, is called Talent Generation: How Visionary Organizations Are Redefining Work and Achieving Great Success. So what were some of those major generational differences that you got curious about and then started studying and writing about throughout all of your books?
Well, again, so I'm a Gen Xer. And so I feel like the Jan Brady of the workforce, along with my fellow Xers, like we just kind of get ignored when it comes to the baby boomers. But again, as I started researching, I really found that this wasn't unusual. You know, when you go back in history and the baby boomers are born, boomers were raised in that post-World War II era, and they really were raised to be the next great generation for America and literally to rebuild America. And they were a huge generation. At that time, they were the largest generation in history and kind of positioned as the next great hope for America. Well, one thing that we don't really think about not only is who's coming next, but we got really comfortable in our organizations. And it makes sense because as I did the research and the data crunching, I found baby boomers were the majority of the workforce for 34 years.
Wow.
Crazy. So again, that's why, we've seen such a tremendous volume of change in recent years, and that's really shaping generations. But also, we're just kind of beginning to really pay attention and recognize, there are other people that need to be heard. And but when we look at career development and what's happening out there in the workforce, it is fascinating because there are differences. So according to my research, baby boomers, and again, we really look for trends. People sometimes critique and say, you're stereotyping me. Well, no, what we try to do is identify trends because we have been able to prove that what's happening in the world when you are coming of age, your most influential years, childhood and adolescence, whatever's happening in the world, we find that really shapes your values, and you carry those values throughout your life. So when we look at this through the career lens, we find that baby boomers tend to be very loyal. They're loyal to country, loyal to employers. They stick around for a long time. And again, that goes back to how they were raised. They seek financial security, and they really value experience, people who have that credibility and that wisdom and knowledge to offer. Well, along comes Generation X, born in 1965 to 1981, and we see major differences. Xers tend to be very independent. Leave me alone and just let me do my work. And they seek work-life balance, and they value honesty. And then along come the millennials, which are actually the largest generation, even larger than the baby boomers, born 1982 to 1995. And we find that they're the opposite of Xers. They're very collaborative. They like to work in teams. They're seeking respect, and they value, more than anything, happiness, a job that brings them that positivity and makes them feel good, which makes sense considering they were raised during an era of terrorism and recession and lots of social change. And then now we have Generation Z coming into the fold. This year, the oldest Zs turned 23. And it's kind of fascinating because we're seeing a return to some of the baby boomer values. So they really value loyalty as well. They are more driven by financial security. We haven't seen that in the workforce in Xers and millennials as much. In fact, Generation Z, we've done surveys, global surveys with them, and they say it's more important for me to have financial security than to be happy at work. And they're very creative and entrepreneurial minded. So you put all these unique skill sets and values and perceptions together, and it makes for a very interesting and diverse workforce. Unlike any other time in history, we've never had this volume of change, and therefore we've never had this volume of such diversity when it comes to skill sets and values in the workforce either.
Yeah, and of all of those skill sets or traits, or values that I saw as a difference when I was teaching between Y and Z was that entrepreneurial bug. But it's also interesting that in Gen Z, they also value kind of what the boomers did in terms of loyalty and financial security. So I find that very curious to have that mix in that particular generation.
Yeah, and again, it kind of makes sense because Z's came of age during the most disruptive decade in history. So, we're talking about the generation born the year of, or they're too young to remember 9/11. So they came into this world post-terrorism, and they saw the recession in great detail, and they're trying to avoid what the millennials have dealt with in terms of recession and college debt. And so, you look at all those trends, and it really does shape us as individuals and how we work, what we want from work.
Yeah. So how does XY University, your company, I noticed on your website that it definitely shows that you work with both employers and businesses as well as associations, because you've done a lot of research and writing in association management as well. How does your company work with these two types of organizations to kind of cut across generational differences and I don't want to say exploit, but definitely maximize each of their own kind of traits and values?
Right. So we do, true to our name, being XYZ University, we do a lot of education, meaning we do a lot of presentations, keynotes, workshops, a lot of trainings. And another piece to that is also research. So going into companies and identifying where there are gaps. Right now, the hot topic is how the heck do I engage my employees? We are experiencing tremendous amounts of employee turnover. Employee turnover has been accelerating in recent years to the point of being extremely detrimental for a lot of organizations. So we research, we identify those gaps and how to bridge those gaps. And same for membership associations. A lot of professional trade associations are seeing dramatic shifts. They're seeing flat or declining membership, really struggling to be relevant to and provide value to younger generations. So again, we research, identify those gaps, and create strategies and recommendations for how to bridge those gaps. And we do a lot of consulting and coaching and just helping organizations to better understand what's going on out there and how to respond to this very disruptive marketplace, but also how to plan for the future and having some of those insights. And one of the things that we do that it always kind of surprises me that organizations are surprised by this tactic, and that is we actually encourage organizations to bring together multiple generations of decision makers and to do think tanks with all types of career backgrounds and experiences and ages. And it's surprising to me how hierarchical so many entities still are, and they will often resist this idea of, well, but they're too young. They just got in this career, and we don't want to talk to students. They wouldn't know anything about this. Well, no, when you're not talking to and engaging future generations, you're missing out on what's to come and what you need to be preparing for. And you're missing that unique perspective that only they can provide.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that, both in the academic as well as the association settings and my own kind of volunteer work and work in the past. So let's go straight to the managers out there, regardless of what generation they happen to be part of. But how do they manage these different values, if you will, for this wide bandwidth or variety of generational differences in the workplace?
Yeah, so what I'm going to tell you is super simple, but it is so true. So for the book, Talent Generation, I spent 2 years researching the most successful high-performing organizations in existence today because I wanted to identify what are their shared traits, what are they doing to engage employees while everyone else is really, really struggling. And I was able to identify kind of 6 key things they do, but even more simple than that, there are 2 main things that these organizations do. They put people first, and they are future focused. So when I say people first, really, really engaging high-performing organizations out there today actually prioritize people even to the point of over profits. And that is a stark difference between, a lot of organizations, what you think back to the 20th century, everything was about the bottom line. It was all about profits. It was all about productivity and how much money are you making. Well, now we're seeing this real boomerang effect, and organizations that are going kind of totally opposite of that. They are really investing in their people. They're asking themselves constantly, what kind of community are we creating in this workplace? Are we bringing experienced leaders to work side by side with entry-level professionals? Because it isn't about silos, and it isn't about titles, and it isn't about hierarchy. It's rather, how are we creating this really vibrant, interactive, and inclusive community? So that's kind of that people-first methodology.
Okay.
And then the second one being future-focused. So really high-performing organizations, I found, dedicate time on a regular basis. For some of them, it's even monthly. They set aside time to be very intentional to talk about, dream about, think about, meet with people who represent the future. So whether that's having a town hall with high school students, or bringing some college students into a board meeting, or they're sitting down and kind of doing what's been dubbed a hackathon, where they're looking at their company through a very different lens, or they're planning 10, 15 years out, not just a couple years out. They're really trying to predict, where is the market going, and are we on path to actually get there, or are we lagging way behind? So that future focus brings things, as a result, organizations work with some urgency, and they are very attuned to where the market's headed, and we find that they stay relevant. They might even stay ahead of the market. And that's kind of where you need to be right now. You have to be disrupting. You have to be evolving. And if you're not evolving, you're dying. So people first and future focus, that's what we find. If you can do those 2 things really well, you're going to be successful.
Yeah, otherwise you end up like Blockbuster or Kodak, right?
Exactly. Oh, yes. My gosh, I love the Kodak story, because a lot of people think that Kodak went under solely because they didn't evolve to digital photography fast enough. And that's a piece of it. But the little known fact is that they were listed on the top 10, like 1 year before they claimed bankruptcy. They were listed on the list of Forbes' top 10 companies that had the oldest average workforce. In other words, they literally were aging out as a company. They had stopped hiring and bringing in young talent. So they became irrelevant. They definitely weren't future focused.
Mm-hmm. And with StrengthsFinder being my number one strength being futuristic, I love hearing that. I love hearing that companies out there are spending dreaming time thinking towards the future. So that gives me hope. What other trends do you see coming in the workplace relative to these generational differences, if any?
Well, I think with the arrival of Gen Z especially, for a while here, all of the attention has been on the millennials and what drives them and what makes them tick. And that makes sense because, as I mentioned, globally, millennials are the largest generation. So in history. So naturally, organizations want to find out, how do we engage them as consumers and employees and all of that. But I think now that Z is coming into the fold, and Z is very different from millennials, it's going to kind of beg the question, have we actually gone too millennial? Meaning a lot of companies literally rebuilt their office spaces to make very collaborative, open spaces. And here comes Z, and Zs are saying, we want more structure. I think we're going to see maybe a little bit of, we have to, again, have that future focus, be in conversation with people who are coming up next. But also, it's not about just catering to one group. It's, again, as I was saying earlier, we have to really think about things in terms of community. It was a bad idea with baby boomers being the majority of the workforce for 34 years. That was just simple demographics, but it was a bad idea when we got really comfortable and stopped passing the baton and stopped thinking about the future with boomers. Well, it's equally detrimental when we put all of our eggs in one basket and just focus on millennials or any other generation. We are a multi-generational workforce. We have to get used to working in connectivity and collaboration and thinking about our workplaces, not as hierarchies or silos, but as communities. So it will be very interesting to see as these move into the workforce, how it's going to change some of these workplaces. But we know for certain that nothing is going to stay the same for very long anymore. It's just a very disruptive era, but also an era driven by ideas and innovation. So things will constantly be improving and changing, and new technologies will emerge. And for some organizations, that's going to be very challenging. And it's my hope that for most organizations, it will be a huge opportunity and really exciting for them to think about all this untapped potential.
Yeah, and so our podcast focused predominantly on career development. So I did want to ask you specifically, have you noticed any kind of differences between particularly Gen Y and Gen Z in terms of what types of feedback they like to get in terms of career development and or their own kind of career paths? I know a 23-year-old probably doesn't have a very long career path yet, but maybe some of their mindsets based upon your research.
Right. So, yeah, that's such a great question. So, yes, with millennials and Zs, there are differences, but there's also some similarities. So, first of all, differences. Millennials like to have frequent feedback, we find, and to be in communication often. And their primary choice for communication, through, as we've identified through numerous surveys and research, they love text and they want instantaneous. So here's what's really fascinating to me, and I think it's very surprising to a lot of people. When we did the global Gen Z survey, they said that they wanted their primary communication in the workforce to be face-to-face. Oh. And again, we haven't seen that since the boomer generation, because for Xers, it was email me.
Yeah.
Yeah, just send me an email. I don't want to talk to you. And then millennials were like, I need more feedback and more instantaneous, the better. And so there's been platforms developed and all kinds of things for that. And now Zs are saying, we love our technology, but more for entertainment. When we're serious about relationship building or in the workforce, we really like that face-to-face communication. So in terms of career development, there's that communication piece, but there's also, I think, organizations need to be aware of what each generation is struggling with in terms of career development. So we find, again, through our research, that baby boomers are really struggling with the idea right now of adapting to change. things are moving kind of fast and furious for them. And we see a lot of leaders really kind of going into a little bit of a shell or almost a freak out mode, or I'm going to hold on to what I know because the unknown is just really scary. So they're struggling to adapt to change. Xers, we find, really, really need leadership development. So because they're following a huge cohort of leaders who've been in power for 34 years, that goes back to the baton passing piece. Xers haven't been well trained, as we have quickly found out, especially in terms of managing and leading people. They need those skills. We find that millennials really need mentoring. They're used to having, again, that goes back to that frequent feedback, but they're also used to having these really close relationships with parents and coaches and teachers throughout their youth. And so as they've moved into the workforce, they really crave learning opportunities from a variety of people and sources, and they want to be mentored. But we also find millennials really need training in certain areas as well. We just did a survey with CPAs, which is a little different than healthcare, but it was very interesting to find that a very large percentage of CPA firms are having to retrain millennials on some very basic accounting skills because colleges are so behind the curve. They haven't kept up with some of the workforce software or different skills or different methodologies. So there's that needing to train. And as these come into the workforce, they tend to be very confident, very, very intelligent. However, they are really struggling with soft skills. And interestingly enough, we've heard from a lot of employers that they are struggling with things like how to use desktop software. So they're used to doing things, even school projects, on tablets, but they come into the workforce and they don't know how to use Microsoft Word or Excel or some of those programs. So we just find that across the board, everyone's kind of in this mode of needing something in regards to training or feedback or guidance. So that's all the more reason to think about how are we working together and are we supporting each other and creating this really great place to work.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. It blows my mind that Microsoft Word is something that they're not using in college, but I guess every program's a little bit different. Let me pick on associations for your final question, Sarah, because I know, back in the day with millennials, there was kind of this argument that they don't join things, groups, trade associations, etc. What kind of trends are you seeing across the generations when it comes to associations and membership of those?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as we have seen, and it's not necessarily just a millennial thing, although they might have spearheaded it, we have seen in the post-recession era, since the Great Recession, that everybody is questioning value. And it's actually influenced consumerism on many, many levels, which is why Macy's and Kohl's and all these stores have sales like every day, a different sale. It's because people aren't buying or they're wanting things for less money. Well, the same mentality is happening with membership associations. So it used to be you joined your professional or trade association because it was the right thing to do. But today we find that people really scrutinize, what do I get in return for my dues? And we actually see this in the workforce too. If I'm coming to work for you, how are you going to help advance my career? What will I learn? We've become wired to think about that return on investment, whether it be financially or otherwise, but that return on investment is driving so many decisions in the workforce and in membership associations today. So associations that are successful at really explaining those member benefits. Here's the package you get in return for your dues. And oh, by the way, it happens to be something that you can't easily access anywhere else. You have to join to be able to get this program or this training or this certification. And then we find that people are more willing to join. But I'll add one more thing in regard to this. So research we've done on the engagement cycle, which again can pertain to associations or workplaces. We find that millennials really differ from other generations in that they want to be invited. So it's very important to them that someone personally reach out and say, hey, you should join this company. You should apply for this job. You should join this association. And then we find that once they do that, once they join, they want something to do like immediately. They want an opportunity to join a committee or lead a task force or write an article or learn and be mentored by somebody. Whereas other generations, boomers and Xers, will kind of sit back, get to know, go to an event, get to know a couple people before they're raising their hand to volunteer. So even how we engage, it differs generationally. And it's so important to just take time to either read research like what we do, or just simply have conversations and dialogues within your team and ask that question of, if we want to engage you, how do we go about doing that?
I guess with Z, that goes back to the face-to-face serious interaction.
Right, exactly. With millennials, it's text.
Yeah, texting. So Sarah, with that, where can people find you, your books, your company around the internet?
Yeah. So best place to find me is XYZUniversity.com. And there you can find information about our services and products. Books are available. There's links there to buy them on Amazon, as well as some of the books are available through ASAE, the American Society of Association Executives. But the best place is XYZUniversity.com.
Well, with that, Sarah Sladek, it's been a pleasure having you on. I'm so glad I finally got you for this. Just kick off season 2. And with that, are you ready for our speed round?
I am so ready.
Perfect. So what is one word that best describes how you work?
Focused.
What's your best shortcut or life hack overall?
Don't get distracted by email or text.
How do you recharge?
I love a good book. I read mystery novels.
What podcasts are you listening to right now?
How I Built This by Guy Raz, NPR.
And last but not least, the question we always leave with, what is the best career advice you ever received?
That's a good one. So do whatever it is that brings you happiness, for therein lies success.
Like that. Sarah Sladek, thank you for joining us on Pharming Your Career.
Thank you, Erin. It was fun.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Pharming Your Career podcast, part of the Pharmacy Podcast Network. If you have ideas or comments for Erin, be sure to contact her through Twitter. Follow her at Erin L. Albert. And remember to keep your career growing.